Greetings, fellow travelers. For the wise among you who don't use Reddit, you may not know that I make a lot of homebrew for D&D 5th edition and post it on the r/Unearthed Arcana subreddit. Thus far, my published works include the Chevalier, the Desperado, the Demonologist, the Diabolist, the Magus, the Shaman, and the Vagabond. Hey, that last one is a really cool name. That's 7 different classes, each with several subclasses, over the course of about 4 years. Suffice it to say, I love making homebrew for this game. Thing is, I haven't posted a new brew in over 2 years. Mostly because I got busy with life, as often happens, but in that time, I have not stopped making homebrew. Just the opposite, I have a backlog of 13, yes, 13 classes that I have yet to post. 7 of them are updated versions of the classes I've already published, but 6 of them are entirely new, certified Kaisara Vagabond originals. So, to kick off my channel, I'd like to start a series where I go over each of my homebrew classes and talk about the process of designing them and why I made the choices that I made. For today's video, I'll be going over the Exorcist. One last thing, though, before we get into it. Much of this video is going to be unscripted, as there's no way I'm going to be able to write down every single one of my thoughts about the class in an orderly and coherent fashion. So, if I ramble on or jump around a lot, I apologize. I'll try to edit out the worst of it, but I'm still getting used to this whole making videos thing. Feedback in the comments would be greatly appreciated. So without further ado, let's talk about the Exorcist. All of my classes start with a core fantasy. A good TTRPG class, especially for the kind of heroic high fantasy that is D&D, should create a strong image in the player's head that draws on archetypes from media. For rangers, you have Aragorn. For wizards, you have Doctor Strange. For rogues, you have Dread Pirate Roberts. I could go on, but the point is, classes exist to fulfill these fantasies, to take what is in the player's head and turn it into a set of mechanics that lets them play that role. The Exorcist core fantasy is drawing on a lot of different things. Actual exorcists, for one, but there's also a little inspiration from the shamans and death knights of World of Warcraft. Kai from Kung Fu Panda 3, a variety of real-world spiritual practices from around the globe involving warding off evil spirits, and a whole lot more. But if I were to boil down the fantasy into a single sentence, I would say that The Exorcist is about binding spirits and using their power as your own. Now, mechanically speaking, The Exorcist is a half-caster, a paladin/ranger style half-caster to be specific. At some point I should make a video that goes into detail about my general approach to class homebrews, but to give you the short version, 5th edition D&D has what I like to call class chassis. 5 of them to be exact. They are marshals, paladin/ranger style half-casters, artificer style half-casters, full casters, and pact casters. The only one we need to understand for this video is the paladin/ranger style half-caster. When it comes to this specific chassis, you're looking at a d10 hit die, proficiency with all weapons and most or all armor types, spellcasting at 2nd level, but no cantrips, a fighting style, and sometimes a feature that spends spell slots. This isn't a hard and fast rule, but more of a guideline to follow. I do follow it pretty exactly with the Exorcist though. The only thing they don't get is heavy armor proficiency, but then again, neither do rangers. I like to give each of my classes 1 or 2 core features that all the other features revolve around. I find that it makes the class feel more cohesive. In the Exorcist case, these features would be Spectral Binding and Exorcism. So let's go over them. Spectral Binding is the Exorcist's 1st level feature, and it's pretty simple. At the end of every long rest, you pick 2 bindings from a big list of options, which I'll be going over in the Unscripted section. Each binding has a passive effect and an exorcism effect, but you only get the passive effect for now. You also get a little modifier for your bindings called Binding Power, which ticks up from 1 to 5 as you gain exorcist levels. Later on, when you start being able to break bindings, you can use your reaction when a nearby creature dies to bind their spirit, which grants you a new binding, but the DM gets to choose which binding it is. We'll get back to why that's important later. I have to give massive credit to the Witch homebrew that was created by u/Zarieth and u/WriteOftenPlayNever. Amazing username, by the way. Which has a feature that works similarly and greatly inspired the Exorcist class as a whole. Link to that homebrew should be in the description. When you get to 2nd level, that's where you get the Exorcism feature. Basically, it lets you expend the spell slot up to the same level as your binding power to break a binding and produce its exorcism effect. Each binding has a unique passive effect and exorcism effect, which again, I'll go over later. Everything else after that is pretty standard fare. Extra attack at 5th level, an ability that lets you keep a binding after exercising it, an ability that lets you bind spirits on a short rest, and an ability that makes you better at wisdom saves, death saves, and saves against the frightened condition. Basic quality of life stuff. There is one feature I do want to talk about though, mostly because I think it's cool. Arts of Expulsion. This lets you do some classic Exorcist shit. It gives you free casts of Protection from Evil and Good, Detect Evil and Good, and later Dispel Evil and Good, equal to your Wisdom modifier. I think it's important that every class has at least a feature or two that is only situationally useful or mostly there for fluff, because ultimately, D&D is a role-playing game, and what fun is a role-playing game if you can't play your role? Anyway, the Exorcist subclasses are called practices, and there's 6 of them. They are the practice of Cultivation, the practice of Malediction, the practice of Mysticism, the practice of Purgation, the practice of Sortilege, and the practice of Vitalism. I'll go over these in the unscripted section, but I do want to make a semi-related point first. If you look at each of my homebrew classes, every single one of them has at least 6 subclasses. Why? Because when I started getting serious about making class homebrews, I decided that I must come up with 6 different unique subclasses in order to justify creating a whole new class. That number is arbitrary, but the point was to get me to make classes that are narrow enough to be different from what's already available, but broad enough to encompass a variety of niches within them. There are plenty of class ideas that I've had to abandon because I simply cannot come up with enough subclasses to justify it being its own thing. This is a restriction that I solely place on myself as a sort of filter for all the many, many ideas in my head. Out of limitation comes creativity, as Debbie Allen once put it. I'm sure I'll be beating this point to death over the course of this series, but the point is to explain my design decisions, and I wouldn't be doing that if I didn't bring this up. With all of that out of the way, I'm going to hand things over to Unscripted Kai to talk about, well, literally everything else. Take it away, me! Thanks, me. Hello and welcome to the unscripted section. As you may have guessed by the name, I don't have a script. I have a list of notes and a lot of things I want to talk about. Starting, of course, getting right into it with the Spectral Bindings. Now for the first version of the class, which is what we are talking about here today, I have created 16 different bindings. I think that number is going to stay relatively the same in future versions, mostly because, as you'll see, the bindings that currently exist pretty much encompass a wide gamut of different mechanics and effects, and I think I've ended up in a good spot. I may cut some, I may add some, may shuffle some things around, but that's for future Kai to worry about when they're working on version 2. But for version 1, there's 16 of them, and I'm not going to go over every single one. If you want to do that, go check out the Reddit post in the description. There is a link, and you can look at all the bindings, read them, back, front, whatever you like. But for today, we're going to point out just a couple of them and talk about my general philosophy as to why I designed them the way I designed them, give some examples, maybe give some examples that need to be changed because I am a critic of my own work, and we're going to have fun doing it. So let's go. So as I mentioned in the scripted portion, the way the Spectral Bindings work is heavily inspired by the Witch homebrew made by u/Zarieth and u/WriteOftenPlayNever. I will never get sick of that username, I think it is so funny. Anyhow, their Witch class has a feature called Binding Right, which is very similar to the way Spectral Bindings work, but it is more geared toward the 1 to 9th level spell slots that the Witch class has. Spectral Bindings do not have the consideration. They work solely from 1st level to 5th level, because the spell slot that you can spend on an exorcism is capped by your binding power, and there's a reason I made that decision. The reason I did that is because when it comes to homebrew, if I'm trying to make a class, I want to make sure that there are no multi-classes that are just stupid busted, right? And one of the considerations for the Exorcist was, well, what if someone takes 2 levels in Exorcist and then takes, say, 18 levels of Cleric or Druid or just any other full caster, especially one that uses Wisdom? Well, then you might have a problem, because exorcisms are designed around the fact that you can only expend a 1st through 5th level spell slot, and if you brought 9th level spell slots to the exorcisms, they would be entirely too powerful. They would be way too busted, so I'm trying to limit that power, and at the same time, preventing multiclasses from becoming too strong by just capping the level of the spell slot you can spend for an exorcism by your binding power. I think it's a pretty elegant solution that prevents the Exorcist from becoming too powerful in its own right, and also from relying on multi-classes to make it work, to make it actually good. So that's why I did that. So there's a set of 3 different bindings that I want to go over first. They are Blessed Spirit, Mystical Spirit, and Wild Spirit. And you'll see kind of the common thread between them, but let's just read them as they are for now. So the Blessed Spirit, I'm just going to read this verbatim. In life, this spirit may have been a devout priest, angelic warrior, or some other favored being. While the spirit is bound to you, damage you take from spells is reduced by an amount equal to your binding power. Exorcism. You can exorcise the spirit as an action. When you do so, choose a spell from the cleric or paladin spell list of a level lower than the level of the spell slot expended, minimum of 1st, and with a casting time of 1 action. You cast the chosen spell without any non-costly material components. That was Blessed Spirit. Mystical Spirit. In life, this spirit may have been a powerful sorcerer, monstrous spellcaster, or other magical being. While this spirit is bound to you, when you deal damage with an exorcist spell, you can add your binding power to one of the spell's damage rolls. Exorcism. You can exorcise the spirit as an action. When you do so, choose a spell from the sorcerer or wizard spell list of a level lower than the level of the spell slot expended, minimum of 1st, and with a casting time of 1 action. You cast the chosen spell without any non-costly material components. Wild Spirit. In life, this spirit may have been an ancient druid, mighty fairy, or some other primal entity. While the spirit is bound to you, you gain a bonus to initiative rolls equal to your binding power. Exorcism. You can exorcise the spirit as an action. When you do so, choose a spell from the druid or ranger spell list of a level lower than the level of the spell slot expended, minimum of 1st, and with a casting time of 1 action. You cast the chosen spell without any non-costly material components. So more or less, 3 of the different spectral bindings that the Exorcist can access grant it the ability to cast spells from 6 different classes: Wizard, Sorcerer, Druid, Ranger, Cleric, and Paladin. The reason I wanted to talk about these is because, as a designer, I have to be my own worst critic. I have to analyze my own work and see what things are probably too powerful, and in this instance, these 3 bindings are probably too powerful. Here's my rationale behind including them anyway. I think they're cool. I swear to you, there is more to it than that, although that is a big factor. One of the things that the base Exorcist class is kind of suffering from, and this is a little bit on purpose, is a lack of features, a lack of versatility, because the versatility comes from the bindings. That's the whole point of the class, is that you don't get many features in and of yourself, but your subclass, your practice, and the spectral bindings that you get are supposed to diversify you, right? And for the most part, you can't control most of the bindings that you are going to get throughout the day, right? You can choose the ones you have at the start of the day, but once you've exercised those and you start binding other spirits, it's the DM that chooses what spirits you're binding, what bindings that you get, and therefore determines kind of what powers you have, right? So the Exorcist is a very interesting class in the fact that you can't necessarily control 100% of what you have in terms of your toolkit. And that is an interesting design space to be playing in. It's why I'm so fascinated with this class. It's why I wanted it to be the first one that I kind of broke down for the series. But it does also mean that it's probably going to be immensely frustrating to play unless every exorcism feels as cool as possible to use, because you're really only probably going to get to use that exorcism once that entire day. So for the wild spirit, the blessed spirit, and the mystical spirit, it's supposed to make you feel cool. It's supposed to make you feel like, wow, I'm doing this really powerful thing where I am casting a wizard spell despite not being a wizard in any capacity, because I killed a wizard, 2 combats ago, and am now using his spirit to force magic into the world. So I just think that the image it creates in the player's head is really cool. It lets you tell a really cool story. It makes sense if you've bound the spirit of a wizard and you exorcise that spirit to cast a spell. That tracks, That doesn't seem out of the ordinary to me. But most importantly, it gives you a lot of versatility that you don't naturally have, because those versatility is meant to come from your bindings. Now, I mentioned, as I did earlier in the scripted section, that the DM chooses what bindings you get when you use your reaction to bind a creature spirit. And I told you in the scripted section that it was important and that we would get back to it later. Well, it's now later, so now I'm going to get into it. Anyone who frequents r/Unearthed Arcana, or someone who makes a lot of homebrew and publishes it online, wherever they may, is going to be familiar with the Bag of Rats problem. The Bag of Rats problem is a mechanical conundrum, let's say, that occurs whenever you have a feature that activates on the death of a creature. The thing that immediately comes to mind for me is Fiend Warlocks get temporary hit points whenever they reduce a creature to 0 hit points. A feature like that, depending on how it's worded or how it works, might encourage a metagamey, power gamey player to carry around a bag of rats or other low hit point creatures. And whenever they need or want temporary hit points, to pull a rat out of the bag, kill it, and use that feature to get that temporary hit points, or whatever feature it is that activates on the death of a creature. In the Exorcist case, it's getting a Spectral Binding. Now, normally, the Bag of Rats problem is something that is acceptable within a certain limit. It is not acceptable in this case. If a power gamey player carried around a bag of rats and just got binding after binding after binding by killing all these rats, that would be an issue because it would completely break the intended power scaling of the class. So my solution was to add a binding to prevent the Bag of Rats problem from becoming a thing. The weak spirit. Just gonna read this verbatim. In life, this spirit may have been a small rodent, frail person, or some other feeble being. You gain no benefit from the spirit being bound to you. Exorcism. When you exorcise this spirit, you do not expend the spell slot used to do so. Essentially, if you are trying to metagame or power game or however you want to phrase it, carrying around a bag of rats or just killing a commoner if you want a spectral binding, the DM can say you get the weak spirit, which grants you no benefit, and the only good thing you can do with it is get rid of it for free. This is how I avoid the Bag of Rats problem with this class. But it hinges on the DM being the one who chooses what your bindings are when you kill a creature. Not when you take a long rest, you can choose those, but when you kill a creature or when a creature dies and you bind their spirit as a reaction, the DM is the one who chooses, not just because it prevents the Bag of Rats problem in this way, but also because it's interesting, it's different. It allows the DM to kind of influence what your exorcist is capable of based on the enemies that you're fighting. And I think in a role-playing game like D&D, if you have a DM that isn't trying to screw you over, I think this could work. I think it could be really fun. Obviously, it's something that would need to be play-tested, which I haven't yet with the Exorcist class, unfortunately, but I would love to, and I think it would be really enjoyable because of this fact. If you trust your DM, and your DM trusts you, and you bring this class to their table, I think you could have a really good time with it, if you're willing to be cooperative. Alright, moving on to another set of 5 bindings. I am not going to read their exorcism effect, but I will read their passive effect. Starting with the Erudite Spirit. In life, this spirit may have been a knowledgeable wizard, a studious scholar, or some other learned mind. While this spirit is bound to you, you gain a bonus to all ability checks that use intelligence equal to your binding power. The Irresistible Spirit. In life, this spirit may have been a manipulative noble, popular bard, or some other magnetic personality. While this spirit is bound to you, you gain a bonus to all ability checks that use charisma equal to your binding power. Shifty Spirit. In life, this spirit may have been a cunning thief, clever beast, or some other sly trickster. While this spirit is bound to you, you gain a bonus to all ability checks that use dexterity equal to your binding power. Violent spirit. In life, this spirit may have been a savage warrior, wrathful demon, or some other brutal destroyer. While this spirit is bound to you, you gain a bonus to all ability checks that use strength equal to your binding power. And finally, the wizened spirit. In life, this spirit may have been an enlightened monk, elderly sage, or some other wise person. While this spirit is bound to you, you gain a bonus to all ability checks that use wisdom equal to your binding power. So like I was saying earlier, where the Exorcist class itself doesn't really provide a lot of power or versatility, because it's meant to come from the bindings, this is part of what I was talking about. You can gain, depending on your level, a 1 to 5 bonus to all checks of a certain ability, as long as you have these spirits bound to you. And if you choose at the start of the day, I would like to have a +3 bonus, for instance, let's say you're level 9 or something. I would like to have a +3 bonus to dexterity checks and wisdom checks for the rest of the day. That's great. However, that means you are locked into holding onto those bindings and not exercising them. When we get to the practices, you'll see that they're all based around exorcism as a feature in some way, shape, or form, so I'm not too worried about this becoming a problem, but I just want to throw in there that the Exorcist could be a really good skill monkey depending on how you play it. My notes say to talk about any other binding that seems cool, and I have picked one out, the Nomadic Spirit. In life, this spirit may have been a wandering merchant, migratory animal, or some other traveling being. While this spirit is bound to you, you gain a bonus to your speed equal to 5 plus 5 times your binding power. So anywhere from 10 to 30. Exorcism. When you exorcise this spirit, you can teleport a number of feet equal to 10 plus 10 times the level of the spell slot expended to an unoccupied space within range. So anywhere from 20 to 60 feet, depending on the spell slot. This one's pretty simple. It has a very simple passive effect and a very simple exorcism effect. And that's nice because some of the other ones are pretty complicated, especially Blessed, Mystical, and Wild, so I tried to throw in a couple that were pretty easy and simple to understand, just to make the whole class more approachable, I would say. Overall, the Spectral Bindings do err on the more powerful side, which is something that may need to be changed in version 2, but especially when it comes to the more powerful passive effects, I'm not so worried because, again, as we'll see, the practices are centered around exorcisms, and you want to be doing those as often as possible, so the passive effects should balance out over the course of the day. Oh, and because I didn't mention it in the scripted section, you get 2 Spectral Bindings at once in the low tier, 3 in the mid tier, and 4 at the high tier. That's the amount that you can prepare, essentially, at the end of a long rest, and the maximum amount you can have just at once. Alright, I believe that is all when it comes to the bindings. Let's move on to the practices. So like I said earlier, there are 6 practices, and each one is supposed to represent a different approach to being an exorcist and dealing with spirits. Quite a wide variety of approaches, as you'll see. I'm very proud of each and every one of these subclasses. I think they're all so thematic and flavorful, and just well designed. So let's go over them. So first is the practice of Cultivation. This practice is based on Cultivation fantasy, which is not something that I'm very well read on. However, I must give credit to u/Fiddlesticks and their Cultivator class for inspiring this subclass in particular. I took some inspiration from that class because it seems like it was made by someone with a lot of love and care and regard for the genre, and someone who tried to take that same idea and port it over to D&D 5th edition, and so the practice of Cultivation borrows a little bit from that Cultivator class. Again, thank you, u/Fiddlesticks. I will try to remember to include a link to that homebrew as well in the description. When it comes to subclasses, not just for the Exorcist, but for all of my classes, I like to designate certain levels as having a particular kind of feature that is common across all of the subclasses. As it pertains to the Exorcist practices, at 3rd level, when you get the practice, every subclass has a feature that does one of 2 things. It either adds on to your exorcism feature, so when you perform an exorcism, you also get a little bonus, or it replaces your exorcism. So when you perform an exorcism, instead of getting the exorcism effect of whatever binding that you break, you instead can choose an alternative effect provided by that subclass. The practice of Cultivation is one of the subclasses that adds a little bonus on top of whatever exorcism you are performing. This is in the form of animating breath. When you exercise a binding, you get a breath point. And because the practice of cultivation is already pretty similar to monks in general, breath points are pretty similar to key points, in the fact that they allow you to make an attack as a bonus action, or to heal yourself as a bonus action. However, when you spend a breath point, you can also spend one of your hit dice, roll it, and add it to the damage or healing that you do. Anyone who's familiar with my Shaman class or Diabolist class knows that I love using hit dice for features like this. I think hit dice are a really underutilized mechanic in D&D 5th edition. They feel mostly like a holdover from previous editions, and I understand why they exist, but I think they should be used for more things, and they are used for a couple of things. Wither and Bloom has people spend a hit die to gain the healing from that spell. There's a Dwarf Racial feat that lets you spend a hit die when you dodge, I'm pretty sure. I know there's a Grave Cleric feature that depends on hit dice for its calculation. But there's just painfully few features in D&D 5th edition that lets a player spend a hit die to do anything, especially anything other than healing. So I try to include mechanics that use hit dice and then actually make them a mechanic that plays into the class. And while the Exorcist as a whole doesn't play around with hit dice very much, I wanted to make sure that at least one of the subclasses did, and it ended up being the practice of cultivation. And I think it makes sense, because if you aren't familiar with cultivation fantasy, my understanding of it is that people spend their entire lives cultivating a sort of internal energy, bolstering their own life force to eventually attain either some level of power or, what seems to be the most common, immortality. Now, while the practice of cultivation does not become immortal, it does become pretty powerful, so let's get into it. All of the features from the subclass end up interacting with breath points. It is the main resource that you are going to be juggling as a practitioner of cultivation. So at 7th level, you get some at the end of a long rest. At 11th level, you can use one to not die when you would otherwise die. When you're reduced to 0 hit points, you can have 1 hit point instead. And later on at 15th and 20th level, you get buffs to your abilities that spend breath points. This is definitely one of the simpler subclasses. To borrow a phrase, it's simple the way a sword is simple. Very strong in the right hands, but perfectly serviceable to anybody else. Moving on to the practice of Malediction, this is your combat-focused subclass, or at least the most combat-focused subclass. These guys get heavy armor and a feature called Grim Malison, which replaces an exorcism, and is basically like Hexblade's Curse if it wasn't fucking around. That is a joke. It is pretty much Hexblade's Curse. However, it does have a little rider that I am pretty proud of. If the cursed creature dies, you can bind its spirit as per your Spectral Binding feature without using your reaction. You must still be within 30 feet of it when it dies in order to do so. So essentially the goal of this subclass is to exercise a binding, curse somebody, attack that target until they die, bind their spirit, and then exercise it again to curse somebody else. That is kind of the basic loop that this subclass is trying to create. And all of its later features are meant to support that. You get a free critical once per day. You can ignore temporary hit points, resistance, and damage reduction a number of times up to your wisdom modifier per day. When your cursed target dies, you can expend a use of your soul change feature to move the curse to somebody else without having to exercise another binding. And at 20th level, you get a feature that when you reduce a creature to 0 hit points, you get one option from a long list. I'll try to put it on screen now. Let you read it for a second. I mean, you can pause the video. Okay, there you go. So the practice of Malediction is a bit more complicated than the practice of cultivation, I would say. But ultimately, again, it's pretty simple compared to some of the other subclasses that we're about to talk about, aka the next one. In any event though, this does work pretty similarly to the Hexblade, and it is definitely a case of overlapping archetypes. There are a handful of subclasses across different classes in the base game that I'm not too worried about this being an instance of copying the Hexblade's homework, and in general, the Exorcist and the Warlock play very differently outside of their subclasses. So you should have no issue having both a Hexblade and a practitioner of Malediction at the same table, and they will still feel pretty different, even if they do have a little bit of overlap in this one area. Alright, the practice of Mysticism. This one is really interesting. It was the first one that I wrote, and has been basically unchanged after writing all of the other ones. Before we get into explaining it proper though, If you pay attention to some of the classes from D&D 5th edition, you'll notice that a lot of them have one subclass that is basically just taking what the base class does and turning it up to 11. This is your champion fighter, this is your Oath of Devotion paladin, this is your hunter ranger. Depending on who you ask, this is either the thief rogue or the assassin rogue. Personally, I think it's the thief rogue. Other people have disagreed with me on this. That's what the practice of mysticism is for the Exorcist. It just takes what the Exorcist already does and turns it up to 11. So for its exorcism feature, it technically has an effect that replaces whatever exorcism you do, but you'll see. It's called Tutelary Spirit. Basically, when you exorcise a binding, instead of exorcising it and getting the effect, you can choose one of your nearby allies within 30 feet, and they get the benefits, passive and exorcism, of that binding for the next minute. Or rather, they get the passive effect for the next minute, and they can choose at any point to produce the exorcism effect. Because you already spent the spell slot, they don't have to do anything other than take the action, bonus action, or reaction, whatever the exorcism requires, to use it. But if they don't use it, the binding returns to you after the minute passes. This is one of those features that I think would be difficult to see a use case for, just kind of like conceptualizing it. But when you're in an actual game and you have a barbarian that is going absolutely haywire, wrecking the enemies, and you have, for instance, the violent spirit, you can use Tutelary Spirit, give the barbarian a bonus to strength checks, and basically a smite effect, which is the exorcism for the violent spirit, and just let them go even more insane, while you, the Exorcist, do something else entirely. To borrow some terminology from the Pathfinder 2nd edition community, the Exorcist is a very selfish class. It doesn't provide a lot of benefits to its allies. Some of the bindings do. Some of the bindings do have benefits for creatures other than yourself, but for the most part, all of your bindings make you more powerful, but do not make your allies more powerful. So the practice of mysticism with the Tutelary Spirit feature is essentially trying to share that power, to give it to your allies, while you, again, do something else with the bindings that you do still have. Every other feature that this subclass gets interacts with Spectral Bindings in some way, shape, or form. At 7th level, you can replace one of the bindings you have with another binding of your choice. This is basically the only way that when the DM decides what binding you get, you can say, nuh-uh. However, it takes a minute, so you can't do it in the middle of combat. At 11th level, you gain a binding whenever you roll initiative and you have a binding slot available. Again, you can have a maximum of 2, 3, or 4, depending on your level. And if you ever start combat, if you roll initiative and you have less than your maximum, you get one of your choice. The DM doesn't decide, you do. And then the 20th level feature takes all of the features from this subclass that you already get and just makes them a little bit more powerful. So yeah, the practice of mysticism is all about controlling your bindings, sharing that power with others, but also determining for yourself what your bindings are going to be. The flavor of this subclass is that, unlike other exorcists, which bind spirits, kind of a dick move if you think about it, the practice of mysticism is more about developing a mutually respectful relationship with spirits, so that when you bind them, they're more willing to work with you as opposed to other exorcist practices. So to me, it makes sense that all of the practice of mysticism's features would be centered on spectral bindings and how you can toy around with them a little bit. Now, I mentioned that the practice of mysticism was the take what the Exorcist already does and turn it up to 11 subclass. The practice of Purgation is not quite that, but slightly adjacent to it. It's more in the direction of the classic Exorcist, the thing that you think of in the real world when you hear the word exorcist. You know, like a priest standing over a child who's possessed by a demon, starts floating above the bed. You know, we've all seen the movies. But yes, the practice of Purgation is more about protecting yourself and your allies and others from spirits or anything that would want to do them harm. Their exorcism feature is Spectral Ward. It replaces an exorcism effect and it creates a 15-foot aura around you where you and all allies gain a bonus to AC and saving throws equal to half the level of the spell slot, rounded up. And again, because the level of the spell slot you expend is capped by your binding power, the highest this bonus is ever going to get at 17th level is +3. However, the bonus increases to be equal to the level of the spell slot, specifically against spirits and ghosts and creatures like that. So we retain some of the flavor where the Exorcist is more effective against spirits and ghosts, but is still plenty effective against other creatures that aren't spirits and ghosts. This is something I like to do if you've read my Demonologist class. The Demonologist is obviously flavored around demons, hunting demons, destroying demons, that sort of thing. However, I didn't want to make it so solely focused on demons because it would then be terrible against every other kind of creature. So it is more effective against demons. It has plenty of features that specifically target demons, but most of its power comes from features that don't care what kind of creature that they are fighting against. Same with the practice of Purgation, more effective against ghosts and spirits, but still plenty effective against everything else. At 7th level, practitioners of Purgation get Purifying Arts. This takes your Arts of Expulsion feature and gives you more spells that you can cast for free using that feature. Now remember, you only have a number of uses of that feature per long rest equal to your Wisdom modifier. So the more spells that you add and the more spells that you start casting using that feature, the less you're going to be able to cast each of those individual spells. But the extra spells that the practice of Purgation gets are Lesser Restoration, Remove Curse, and Aura of Purity. So 3 extra spells for a total of 6 by the time you get to 18th level, and they're all pretty flavorful too. These 3 spells are all based around removing some kind of negative effect, like Lesser Restoration can remove a variety of conditions, Remove Curse, it's in the name, Aura of Purity, basically Lesser Restoration, but if it lasted for a minute and affected every creature within a 30-foot radius of you. At 11th level, you get a reaction to do radiant damage to creatures that attack your allies. The radiant damage is increased if you have Spectral Ward up. 15th level, you get a similar feature to the Paladin's Cleansing Touch, and at 20th level, you get a pretty powerful upgrade to your Spectral Ward ability. The practice of Purgation is obviously more of a support and defender kind of subclass, as opposed to the practice of Cultivation, which is very defensive and tanky, but only for itself. The practice of Purgation is about defending your allies, supporting your allies, making sure they aren't affected by any harmful conditions, making sure that when creatures attack them, they get punished for it, that sort of thing. Up next is the practice of Sortilege, and I am a big fan of this one. For a long time now, I've had this idea for a martial or half-caster subclass that uses divination magic or visions or something of that nature to see into the future and become more effective in combat as a result of that. Like, you can see your enemy coming, you know what moves they're going to make, and so you gain a bonus to your attacks and saving throws and whatnot against those enemies. I always thought that was a really cool idea, but I could never make it work. There was a version of the Magus class where there was going to be a subclass that did something like that, but again, it just didn't feel right. I couldn't make it work. But with the Exorcist, I finally found a way to make it flavorful, effective, and just overall pretty cool, if I may be so bold. The practice of Sortilege is built around ephemeral visions. Basically, whenever you exercise a binding, on top of that, you also get a vision die. The size is based on the level of the spell slot. So it's D4 for a first level, D6 for second level, D8 for third level, D10 for fourth level, and D12 for fifth level. So the higher level spell slot you expend, the bigger of a die that you end up with. And you can use these vision dice whenever you make an attack roll or a saving throw to roll it and add it to the result. It's a little bit like Bardic Inspiration, but only for yourself. Well, we'll get to that. At 7th level, you get Words of Warning, which lets you take your vision die, and as a reaction, when someone else rolls an attack roll or saving throw, you can give them the vision die, or at least you roll it and they get the bonus. So again, a little bit like Bardic Inspiration, mostly focus on yourself because it does take your reaction to grant them this vision die. At 11th level, you get a vision die at the end of every long rest. At 15th level, the first vision die you roll each round, you can roll it twice and take the higher result. And at 20th level, this one's a doozy, you permanently gain the effects of the True Seeing spell, which grants you True Sight to 120 feet. As I said, this is permanent. From 20th level onward, if you have this subclass, you always have the True Seeing spell. I figure that when you reach 20th level, balance should kind of go out the window a little bit, mostly because if a campaign gets to that point, the players deserve to have all the power they can get, because they've earned it. But yes, the practice of Sortilege is in a weird kind of middle ground where it's not quite combat focused exclusively, it's also not quite support focused or utility focused exclusively. It has kind of a little bit of both, but the one thing it does have in spades is just cool factor. Now for our final subclass, and the one I'm probably going to spend the most time talking about, the practice of Vitalism. Very simply, the practice of Vitalism is your healing subclass. I didn't mention it earlier, but there is a Spectral Binding that lets you heal yourself or an ally when you exercise it, and there's obviously plenty of healing spells in the Exorcist spell list, which we will be going over here in a second. So the practice of Vitalism is just taking that and kind of focusing more on the healing aspect. Its exorcism feature is called Dispersal. Essentially, when you exercise a binding, on top of that you disperse the kind of excess spiritual energy in a 15-foot aura that lasts a number of rounds equal to the level of the spell slot you expended. So if you expended a 2nd level spell slot, it lasts for 2 rounds. If you expended a 5th level spell slot, it lasts for 5 rounds. At the top of each round, on your turn, at the start of your turn specifically, you and every ally inside the aura regain hit points equal to 1d4 plus your binding power. So a little bit of passive healing for a number of rounds, again equal to the level of the spell slot expended for the exorcism. Now I know I said that this was the healing focused subclass, and it is, but it doesn't have that many features that heal, because the Exorcist is a half-caster, as I've mentioned. And one of the things that half-casters are not really suited towards is being healers. Like, Paladins and Rangers can do it. Paladins especially can very effectively heal people. They have Lay on Hands, they have all these healing spells. Some of their subclasses grant them bonuses to healing. But the thing is, if you're playing a half-caster, especially a Paladin/Ranger style half-caster, you want to be getting in the fight, you want to be attacking creatures, you have extra attack, you want to be taking advantage of the fact that you are basically a martial who also has spells. You don't necessarily want to bog yourself down, healing all your allies all the time, because you don't have the spell slots to sustain that to the same level as a cleric or a druid or a bard. And even if you did have the number of spell slots, you don't have spell slots of a high enough level to compare to them anyway. So one of the challenges with coming up with a healing focused subclass for a half-caster like the Exorcist is, how are they meant to heal and still be present in the combat? Dispersal was kind of my compromise. It isn't the most amazing healing feature, not by a long shot. Its main saving grace is that it's an AoE heal, an area of effect heal, which is not something that the Exorcist is going to be getting for another 6 levels, and that even full casters won't be getting for another 2 levels with Mass Healing Word. Anyway, the other main mechanic that the practice of Vitalism toys around with is temporary hit points, and Living Soul, which you get at 7th level with this subclass, turns any excess healing you would do into temporary hit points. So let's say someone is missing 5 hit points and you heal them for 10. They regain 5 hit points, and then on top of that, they get 5 temporary hit points. This applies to you always, and you can apply it to any other creature as a reaction. As I'm so fond of saying, we will get back to this later, will become important when we get to 15th level. Alright, this next feature, I'm kind of iffy on, I think it might be too strong. Wake the Lost. You get this at 11th level, and essentially, you learn the Revivify spell, it's like a bonus spell, and you can cast it using uses of Arts of Expulsion. Now, every other spell, even from Purifying Arts with the practice of Purgation and from the base feature, only 1 use needs to be expended to get a free cast of those spells. Revivify takes 2 uses, but you don't need to expend a spell slot, and on top of that, whenever you cast Revivify, you can ignore the costly material component, which I believe is 300 gold worth of diamonds, if you have the spirit of that creature bound to you. So the use case would be, let's say you're an exorcist of the practice of Vitalism, and one of your allies dies, fully goes down, fails all death saving throws, dead. However, you are within 30 feet, so you use your reaction to bind their spirit. And then after the combat ends, you rush over, you expend 2 uses of Arts of Expulsion to bring your ally back up, and because you have their spirit bound, you don't need the diamonds, you don't need the material component, you just shove their spirit right back into their body. This does break the binding, but in return, you save 300 gold, so I think that's fair. Like I said, I think this might be a little bit too powerful. As far as I'm aware, no feature in D&D 5th edition ever interacts with any of the resurrection spells. That and letting you revive someone without expending a spell slot or using the material component seems like it could be a little busted, But on the other hand, you're 11th level at this point. You have the spell slots to cast the spell, you probably have enough gold to afford the components. At this point, this feature might as well be quality of life. Again, I am kind of iffy on it. As always, I will listen to the feedback regarding this. If people think it is way too strong, then I will probably tweak it. But for the first version of the Exorcist, this is how the feature works, and that's how it's going to be. Remember what I said about Enlivened Soul and the temporary hit points that it grants you? It's becoming important now. When you, or an ally, hits a creature with a weapon attack, you can sacrifice any of the temporary hit points you may have at that moment to deal additional necrotic damage equal to the amount that you sacrifice. So if you have 20 temporary hit points, you hit a creature with a weapon attack and you sacrifice 10 of them, you do 10 extra necrotic damage. Like I said, your allies can do this too, but only if you gave them the temporary hit points. But as long as they're from you, they can also sacrifice them to do this extra damage. So like I was saying earlier, because the practice of Vitalism is a healing focused subclass for a half caster, I wanted to give them features that kind of encouraged a battle medic kind of playstyle, where granting your allies healing and temporary hit points not only does those things, heals them and grants them temporary hit points, but also makes them more effective as combatants, so that when you heal them, you can do it without focusing solely on that, and then on top of that, your allies are doing a little bit of extra damage because of all the temporary hit points you might be giving them. And finally, at 20th level, you get a feature that lets you use Dispersal as a reaction when a creature dies within 30 feet of you. However, you do this instead of binding their spirit. So it's kind of a, do you need the healing right away, or do you bind the spirit and get the healing later? It's kind of the decision you have to make. But also, whenever you roll dice to restore hit points, you can choose to instead just use the maximum. Alright, now we get onto the spell list. Most half-casters, especially Paladin and Ranger style half-casters, that term is a bit of a mouthful, but I'm going to keep using it because it's accurate, have a very limited spell selection. Obviously, over the course of 5e's lifespan, more and more spells have been added, spell lists have gotten longer, optional expanded spells have also been added through like Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, but the Paladin, Ranger, and in this case Exorcist, don't have the longest spell list, and they don't need one because they don't have a lot of spell slots. They're not going to be preparing or learning a lot of spells anyway, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. I'm obviously not going to go over the entire spell list right here, right now. I'm probably going to include in post just an image of the spell list and all the spells that are on it. But yeah, most of the spells are necromancy spells, healing spells, and a little bit of divination thrown in there for funsies and for the practice of sortilege. There's also a little bit of utility in there. The Exorcist spell list mostly borrows from the Cleric and the Paladin more than any other class, so you're going to find a lot of overlap there. But importantly, the Exorcist does actually get ritual casting, so you are going to get some benefit from things like Speak with Dead and Augury and other ritual spells that I'm not remembering right now. Anyway, so that is all the mechanical stuff that I'm going to be talking about. Now I'm going to move on to just talking about the class and some other miscellaneous stuff. Then we're going to round out the unscripted section, and I'm going to send this off to be edited by future me. So first thing, multiclassing. This is definitely going to multiclass very, very well with clerics and monks, and really any wisdom-based class. I could actually see Ranger/Exorcist being a really interesting option depending on where you allocate the levels. Like I said before, I try to think about multiclassing when I'm creating my classes because I want them to fit in with the 13 classes that already exist. And if they're gonna fit in, then they need to consider what would happen if you multiclassed one of those classes with one of my homebrew classes. That can obviously produce some unintended interactions, and I don't want things to get too busted because I had an oversight and made a particular combination really strong without even really knowing it. Speaking of, there is one combination I am a little worried about, and obviously this is going to depend on what people say when they read the class, but Barbarian/Exorcist might be a little too good. So to combat that, I'm thinking for version 2 of this class, I'm going to add a stipulation to the Exorcism feature that you must be able to cast spells in order to use it. This is mostly to prevent a Raging Barbarian from using any of the exorcisms that are more defensive in nature, because I think that, on top of the resistance they're already getting, would just be a little bit too much. So that's, again, a consideration for version 2, but for version 1, there's no restriction like that. So we're going to see if people react positively or negatively to that. Overall, I think this class is going to play pretty nice with every other class that's out there. Again, there might be some combinations that I'm not thinking of, some things that might be a little bit too strong, but again, that's for the feedback I am given in the comments on the Reddit post to tell me. There is another thing I want to talk about, and this has nothing to do with the class. It is entirely focused on the document itself, but I managed to find some really great art for this class. And when it comes to making these documents, I try to find really good art that shows off what the class can be, the different directions you can take it in, mostly to get the gears turning in people's head, give them something to look at, be like, oh, that's what I want to play, or oh, I want my character to look like that. So I obviously can't show off every single art piece. You're gonna have to go to the document itself to look at them. I promise you they're all gorgeous. But there is one guy that I do want to call out and thank for all the gorgeous art I was able to find on his DeviantArt. Captain Diablo, or CaptDiablo, on DeviantArt.com. Absolutely beautiful artist. Made the cover page art, made the back cover page art, and made the art on the spell list page. Beautiful stuff. Very flavorful, very much fit what I was going for with this class. So I just wanted to shout that guy out, Captain Diablo on DeviantArt. Absolutely wonderful stuff. Every artist, too, has made truly amazing work. Every art piece that I found for this class has just been chef's kiss, exactly what I need. So thank you to all the artists. On the back cover page of the document, you can find every art credit, so absolutely go check those people out. Alright, I have it in my notes here that it is time to get into the self-criticism section. I've obviously been mentioning different things that I think are good and bad about my own class, but honing in on the stuff that I think might need to be changed or revised in future versions. The class as a whole, like I said, not many class features. Most of the power and versatility comes from the subclasses and the bindings. However, with all the 16 bindings that there are, I think it might be a little bit too versatile. I remember when the Mystic Unearthed Arcana, the UA that WotC released for the Mystic class way back when, a lot of the criticism of that class was, it's the ultimate Swiss Army knife. It could do anything. It could heal, it could be a melee fighter, it could be a long-range devastating spellcaster, it could do this, that, and the other thing, and a lot of the problem with that was, it could do some of these things better than the classes that are supposed to be the best at those things. Like, it could be a better spell damage dealer than an evocation wizard. It could be a better healer than a life cleric. It could be a better bard than a bard. So because of that, I'm always wary of when I give a class a little bit too much versatility, because the kind of payoff for that is, well, this class can do that really well, and all of these other things semi-decently. On the other hand, this class is more like solely focused on that thing, so it is the best at it, to the exclusion of most everything else. Now obviously in D&D 5th edition, you're never going to have a character that is just a healer, right? That does healing and healing only and never does anything else. That's not really a thing in this game, but still, you do have to think about versatility and the breadth and depth of the mechanics, right? How much can this class do? And how well can they do it? Those are the two things you really have to consider. And with the Exorcist, it might be able to do a little bit too much. It doesn't do all of it super well, because again, you're not deciding every one of your spectral bindings. The DM is going to be deciding for you what a lot of your spectral bindings are throughout the day. So that might be the limiting factor, and maybe that's balanced? I'm not entirely sure. Again, I haven't been able to playtest this yet, because I finished it within the last couple weeks. So hopefully after some playtesting and some feedback from the people on the r/Unearthed Arcana subreddit, I will be able to get a better idea of, is it too much, is it too little, is it too strong? We shall see. My other worry is that it may be a little complicated. Now, a complicated class is not a bad thing. The Artificer is complicated. And it's kind of the same with the Exorcist, right? You have these spectral bindings, you have to worry about exorcisms, and that's not even including whatever your subclass is doing for you. If you're like the practice of Cultivation or the practice of Sortilege, you have this whole other resource you gotta worry about. It can be a lot. So my worry is someone who doesn't fully understand what this class is trying to do might pick it up and be kind of turned off from it because it's just so much and there's so many different things that they have to keep track of. And especially when you have the DM coming in saying like, you have, this is the feature that you're getting at this time and you have to use it. I don't know. I think it might be able to leave a bad taste in someone's mouth. But on the other hand, someone who does grasp what the class is and is willing to keep track of all of those things and doesn't mind the complexity might get a lot out of it. Would I go so far as to say it's the most complicated class I've ever made? Probably not. I don't know what class that title would belong to, but I don't think it's this one. This one is definitely up there, but I don't think it is the Exorcist. Anyway, I'm starting to run out of things to say, so I think it is finally time to pass things off to Scripted Kai once more to do the outro. I thank you all for sitting through this long ramble. Again, hopefully the editing has made it bearable to watch, but in any event, I really appreciate it. Whew, I believe that is everything I have to say about The Exorcist. All told, I'm really happy with how it came out. I've linked the r/unearthed arcana post in the description for you guys to check out, where the entire class document is available in image, PDF, and GM binder form. If you're here from the Reddit post, 1,000 thank yous for sitting through this entire video and supporting the channel. Of course, any and all feedback on the class itself is welcome. That's why I publish my homebrew online. It's so that I can get fresh eyes on my work and see what needs to be changed, added, removed, clarified, fixed, etc. Leave it here or under the Reddit post, I don't mind either way. If you enjoyed this video and want to stick around, you know what buttons to press to make that happen. Until next we meet, farewell, fellow travelers.